I'm 79 years old now. My name is Harold, and I spent most of my life believing that if you gave your children everything, they would grow up to give you respect in return. That if you sacrificed enough, loved deeply enough, stayed patient long enough, one day they would look at you with the same kindness you showed them. But there's a moment in life, a quiet, painful moment when you realize something has changed. Not loudly, not suddenly, just a shift in the way they speak to you, the tone, the distance, the absence of warmth. It happened to me one winter evening. My daughter was sitting across from me in the living room, the same room where I used to read her bedtime stories, where I'd fall asleep on the couch waiting for her to come home safely. I said something small, I don't even remember what, just an opinion, just a father speaking. And she looked at me, not with anger, but with something colder. And she said, "Dad, you don't really understand how things work anymore." It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel in the obvious way, but something inside me cracked. Because in that moment, I wasn't her father anymore, I was irrelevant, and I didn't realize it then, but that moment wasn't the beginning. It was the result of years of ignoring signs, of accepting things I shouldn't have accepted, of confusing love with endurance. When I was younger, I thought being a good father meant saying yes more than no. I worked long hours as a mechanic, came home tired, hands covered in grease, but I never let them see how exhausted I was. I made sure they had what I didn't growing up: better clothes, better opportunities, a softer life. I missed birthdays sometimes, missed school events, told myself it was worth it because I was providing, because that's what fathers do. And every time I felt that quiet guilt, I would make up for it by giving more money, more freedom, more understanding. I thought love was measured by how much you were willing to give up. But I didn't realize something important. If you give everything without boundaries, people don't always see it as love. Sometimes they see it as something they're entitled to. When my children got older, things started to shift. Slowly at first. Small things. The way they interrupted me, the way my opinions were brushed aside, the way conversations felt less like conversations and more like negotiations. But I ignored it because I told myself they're just growing, they're stressed, life is hard for them. I made excuses for them the same way I used to make sacrifices for them. Until one day, my son said something I will never forget. He was sitting at my kitchen table, same table where I'd helped him with math homework, where we'd laughed over burnt pancakes on Sunday mornings. He needed money again, and I hesitated just for a second. And he leaned back in his chair and said, "After everything I've dealt with growing up, I think you owe me this." I remember feeling confused at first, then hurt, then something deeper, something I didn't want to name, because what he said wasn't just about money, it was about everything. In his mind, my love had become a debt. All those years I thought I was giving freely, he saw it differently. He saw it as something that could be used, something that could be claimed. And I stayed in that moment. I tried to explain myself, tried to defend the life I had lived, the choices I had made. But the more I spoke, the less he listened, because that kind of statement, it's not an invitation to understand each other. It's a declaration. And I wish I had understood that earlier. Because when someone believes you owe them for loving them, there is no end to what they will take. And the more you give, the more they feel justified in asking for more. I didn't walk away that day. I stayed. And staying cost me more than leaving ever would have. Not just money, but something harder to rebuild, my dignity. Over time, I started noticing other things. My words carried less weight. My presence felt optional. Conversations became one-sided. If I disagreed, even gently, it would turn into something bigger. And then there was another phrase, one that sounded harmless, but slowly erased me. "You're from a different time, Dad." It was said with a smile sometimes, other times with a sigh, but the meaning was always the same. "You don't belong here anymore." At first I accepted it. I told myself, maybe they're right. The world is different. Technology has changed. People think differently now. So I started speaking less, holding back my thought, choosing silence over conflict. And little by little, I disappeared from my own family's conversations. Not physically, but emotionally. I became someone who was there, but not heard. Seen, but not valued, and that kind of silence, it does something to you. It makes you question yourself. Makes you wonder if maybe you've become what they say you are. Outdated, irrelevant. But one night, sitting alone in that same living room, I realized something. They weren't dismissing my knowledge of the world. They were dismissing me, my experiences, my struggles, my life, everything I had lived through, reduced to something unimportant. And that realization, it hurt more than any argument ever could, because I had spent decades building a life for them only to feel like I had no place in it anymore. And still, I didn't leave because I was afraid of losing them, afraid of being alone, afraid that if I stepped back, there would be nothing left. So I stayed in conversations that made me feel small. I accepted words that slowly chipped away at my self-respect. I convinced myself that love meant enduring discomfort, that being a parent meant tolerating anything. But I was wrong, and it took me nearly 8 decades to understand that. Because love, real love, does not require you to lose yourself. It doesn't demand silence. It doesn't turn your past into something that can be used against you. But I didn't see it then. I only felt the weight of it growing heavier each year. And I kept carrying it, because I thought that's what a father does. He carries no matter how heavy it gets, until one day he realizes he's been carrying something that was never his to hold in the first place. I remember the exact moment things became impossible to ignore. It wasn't a big fight, no shouting, no doors slammed, just a quiet conversation that turned into something else, something colder. My youngest son had come over that afternoon. He sat across from me, scrolling through his phone, barely looking up. I tried to start a conversation, asked him how work was going, how he was feeling lately. Simple things. The kind of things a father asks because he still cares. He answered, but not really. Short replies. Distracted, like I was background noise. Then eventually he asked for help. Money again. It had become a pattern by then. Not always large amounts, but frequent enough that I started to feel it, not just in my wallet, but somewhere deeper. This time I didn't say yes immediately. I paused, and that pause, it changed everything. He looked up, finally giving me his full attention. But it wasn't the kind of attention you want from your child. There was irritation in his eyes, frustration, something close to resentment. And he said, "You know what? Forget it. I'll figure it out myself." Those words, I had heard them before, many times, but something about the way he said it that day, it felt different. Final, sharp, not independence. A warning. And my chest tightened in a way I can't fully explain. It wasn't just fear, it was panic. the kind of panic that makes you act before you think. Because what I heard wasn't, I'll handle it. What I heard was, you're failing me. What I heard was, if you don't help me, I'll pull away. And I couldn't bear that. So I did what I had trained myself to do for years. I gave in. I said, no, it's fine. Tell me what you need. And just like that, the tension disappeared. He relaxed, smiled even, like everything was normal again. But inside me, something shifted, because for the first time I saw the pattern clearly. This wasn't a conversation between a father and a son, it was leverage. He had learned somewhere along the way that my love for him, my fear of losing him, could be used, not always consciously, not always cruelly, but effectively. And I had allowed it. Every time I chose peace over honesty, every time I chose connection over self-respect, every time I ignored that quiet voice inside me that said, this isn't right, I was teaching him how to treat me. And that realization, it was heavy. He left later that evening, thanking me casually, already moving on with his day. But I stayed sitting there, staring at the empty chair across from me. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I had been negotiating for my place in my own child's life. Not earning it, negotiating it. That night I couldn't sleep. Memories kept coming back to me. Moments I had brushed off before, now seen in a different light. The times they dismissed my feelings, the times they turned things around on me, the times I walked away from conversations feeling confused, like somehow I had done something wrong without understanding how. And then there was one phrase, one that nearly broke me completely. My oldest son said it during an argument years ago. You're the reason I turned out like this. I remember going completely still when he said it, because there are some words that don't just hurt. They settle into you. They stay. I didn't argue back. I didn't defend myself. I just listened. And after that conversation ended, I sat alone and started going through my entire life as a father. Every mistake, every moment I lost my patience, every time I wasn't there when I should have been, every decision I regretted, I replayed it all, over and over, because a part of me believed him, believed that maybe I had ruined something, that maybe all the struggles he faced, all the pain he carried, somehow traced back to me, and for a long time I carried that weight, quietly. I didn't talk about it, didn't tell anyone, just let it sit inside me, growing heavier with time. But something changed as I got older. Maybe it was age, maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the simple truth that a man can only carry so much guilt before he starts questioning whether it all belongs to him. Because one day I asked myself a question I had been avoiding for years. How long do I keep taking responsibility for a life that is no longer mine to live? My son was in his 40s. He had lived decades outside of my home, made his own choices, walked his own path. Yes, I was part of his beginning, but I was not the author of his entire story, and neither is any parent. We guide, we teach, we try, but we are human, we make mistakes, and so do they. But blaming a parent for everything, that's not healing, that's avoidance. Because as long as someone else is responsible for your life, you never have to take ownership of it. And I realized something painful, but necessary. As long as I accepted that blame, he would never have to change, and I would never be free. So the next time it came up, and it did, I responded differently, not with anger, not with defensiveness, but with something I had never allowed myself before. Clarity. I told him, I did the best I could with what I knew at the time, but your life now, That belongs to you. He didn't like that. I could see it in his face. Because for the first time, I wasn't accepting the role he had placed me in. The role of the one who is always wrong, always guilty, always responsible. And that moment, it changed something between us. Not instantly, not dramatically, but permanently. Because when you stop accepting blame that isn't yours, people who depend on that dynamic, they feel it and they resist it. But that resistance, it's part of the truth coming to the surface. And truth, it's uncomfortable, especially when it disrupts something that has been working for one side. But there was still more. More things I had ignored, more things I needed to understand. Because the deeper I looked, the more I realized this wasn't just about money or blame or small arguments. It was about something bigger, something quieter but more damaging. The slow erosion of respect. And once that begins, if you don't stop it, it takes everything with it. Your voice, your confidence, your sense of self. And I was beginning to see just how much of myself I had already lost. There comes a point in your life when you stop asking, why are they treating me this way? And you start asking something much more important. Why have I allowed it for so long? I wish I could tell you that realization brought me peace immediately. It didn't. It brought me discomfort, regret, a deep, quiet sadness that settled into my bones. Because once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. And I began to see it everywhere. In the way my daughter would laugh lightly when I tried to express something serious, brushing it off like it was nothing. In the way my son would interrupt me mid-sentence, not even noticing he had done it. In the way conversations would turn, slowly, subtly, until somehow I was the one apologizing, even when I hadn't done anything wrong. And then one afternoon, something happened that forced me to finally draw a line. My daughter and I were sitting together having coffee. It started as a normal conversation, but I made the mistake of telling her that something she had said to me the week before had hurt me. I didn't accuse her. I didn't raise my voice. I just told the truth. And she looked at me, sighed, and said, "Dad, you're being dramatic. It's not that serious." That word, dramatic. It sounds so small, doesn't it? But in that moment, it felt like my entire reality had been dismissed. Like my feelings were something inconvenient, something embarrassing, something not worth taking seriously. And I felt it again, that old instinct to shrink, to backtrack, to say, maybe you're right, maybe I'm overreacting. Because that's what I had been trained to do over the years. Not by her alone, but by the pattern we had both fallen into. But this time, something in me refused. Maybe it was age, maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the simple truth that I didn't have enough years left to keep pretending that being disrespected was the same thing as being loved. So I looked at her calmly and I said, "My feelings are not dramatic. You don't have to agree with them, but you don't get to dismiss them." And then I did something I had never done before. I stood up and I left the room. It sounds simple, but for me, it felt like breaking a lifetime habit. Because walking away is not easy when you've spent your whole life staying through discomfort, staying through disrespect, staying through silence. But sometimes staying is what destroys you. And leaving even for a moment is what begins to rebuild you. That was the first time. But it wasn't the last. Because once you start recognizing these moments, you begin to see them clearly. And then came the hardest one of all. The phrase that no parent is ever prepared to hear. "You never really cared about me." My youngest said it during an argument. It came out of nowhere. Sharp, final, like a door slamming shut, and for a second I couldn't breathe. Because how do you respond to something like that? How do you defend a lifetime? The sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the quiet worries no one ever saw. The love you gave in 1,000 small ways that were never documented, never measured, never acknowledged. I felt that old instinct again, to prove myself, to list everything I had done, to remind him of all the moments that mattered. But then I stopped, because I finally understood something I wish I had known decades earlier. If someone has decided that your love didn't exist, no amount of explanation will change their mind. Because it's not about truth, it's about perception, it's about the story they've chosen to tell themselves. And you cannot spend the rest of your life trying to rewrite a story someone is committed to believing. So instead, I said something different, something simple. I know what I gave. I know it was real. I'm sorry you don't feel it, but I won't argue about it. And I walked away, not in anger, not in defeat, but in acceptance. Acceptance that I could not control how they saw me, only how I allowed myself to be treated. And then there was one final moment, the one that made everything clear, the one that changed how I saw everything. I had tried to set a boundary with my daughter, a small one. I told her I couldn't keep helping her financially the way I had been. And instead of listening, instead of even discussing it, she looked at me with concern, almost pity, and said, "Dad, I think you need help. You're not thinking clearly." That sentence, it shook me, because for a brief moment I questioned myself. Am I wrong? Am I being unreasonable? Am I losing something? And that's when I realized how dangerous that kind of statement is, because it doesn't just dismiss you, it makes you doubt yourself, your memory, your judgment, your reality. And once you lose trust in yourself, you lose everything. But this time, I didn't fall into it. I didn't second guess myself. I didn't apologize. I looked at her and I said, I know exactly what I'm doing, and I trust myself. And then I walked away. Not just from that conversation, but from the version of myself that believed love meant accepting anything. Because here's what I've learned. After 79 years of life, love without respect is not love. It's obligation. It's control. It's a slow erosion of who you are. And being a parent, it does not mean you surrender your dignity. It does not mean you accept every word, every tone, every behavior just to keep the relationship alive. Because a relationship that requires you to disappear is not one worth holding on to in the same way. That doesn't mean you stop loving them. You don't. I still love my children more than I can explain. That never goes away. But love, it has to include yourself too. And for most of my life, it didn't. I gave them patience, but not myself. I gave them understanding, but not myself. I gave them forgiveness again and again, but never asked for respect in return. And that imbalance, it cost me years. Years of silence, years of doubt, years of feeling small in places where I should have felt valued. But not anymore. Because I finally understand something simple, something powerful. You can love someone and still walk away from how they treat you. You can care deeply and still say no. You can be a parent and still choose yourself. And when you do that, something changes. Maybe they notice, maybe they don't. Maybe they come back with respect. Maybe they stay distant. You can't control that. But what you can control is what you accept, what you allow, what you tolerate, and more importantly, what you refuse. If you're listening to this and something inside you feels familiar, that quiet recognition, that unspoken understanding, then hear this. You are not wrong for wanting respect. You are not weak for feeling hurt. You are not selfish for setting boundaries. You are simply human. And it's never too late to protect that. I learned it late. Too late, maybe, but not so late that I couldn't change the way I live the rest of my life. And if you're still here, still listening, then maybe you're not too late either. Maybe this is your moment. Not to fight, not to argue, but to quietly, firmly choose yourself. Because in the end, after everything you've given, you deserve peace. And sometimes peace begins the moment you stand up and walk away.